In the closing months of the Second World War, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands from every direction, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Hidden in fortified bunkers and camouflaged anchorages, 3 enormous submarines were being readied for a mission that would strike at the heart of American power. These were not ordinary submarines. They were underwater aircraft carriers, vessels so large and so revolutionary that they defied the categories naval architects had established over decades of submarine development. They were designed to cross the Pacific undetected, surface within striking distance of the American mainland, launch bomber aircraft against strategic targets, and disappear before any response could be organized. Their primary objective was the Panama Canal, the vital waterway that connected the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. Their secondary targets included New York City, Washington, and San Francisco. They were the I-400 class, and they represented Japan's last, desperate hope for a weapon that could change the course of a war already lost. The concept of the submarine aircraft carrier had intrigued naval planners since the 1920s. Several nations, including Britain, France, and the United States, had experimented with submarines capable of carrying small float planes for reconnaissance purposes. These early efforts produced vessels that could launch and recover a single aircraft, useful for scouting but hardly revolutionary. The Japanese took the concept further than anyone else, driven by the unique strategic challenges of Pacific warfare. Japan's island empire was scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, making long-range reconnaissance essential. At the same time, Japan's relative weakness in industrial capacity compared to the United States made unconventional approaches attractive. If Japan could not outproduce America, perhaps it could outthink her. The I-400 program began in 1942, authorized by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself in the aftermath of the Midway disaster. Yamamoto understood that Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific, that the war of attrition he had warned against was now inevitable, and that conventional operations would lead to eventual defeat. He sought weapons that could bypass American strengths, that could strike at vulnerable points far from the main theaters of combat. The submarine aircraft carrier seemed to offer such possibilities: a vessel that could approach the American coast undetected, launch aircraft against high-value targets, and escape before defenses could respond, might inflict damage disproportionate to its cost. It might also force the Americans to divert resources to homeland defense, weakening their offensive capacity in the Pacific. The specifications Yamamoto approved were staggering. The I-400 class would be the largest submarines ever built, over 120 meters in length, displacing over 6,000 tons submerged. They would carry 3 Aichi M6A Seiran attack aircraft in a waterproof hangar mounted forward of the conning tower. Their range would exceed 30,000 nautical miles, enough to circumnavigate the globe without refueling. Their crew would number over 200 men, more than twice the complement of a typical submarine. Every aspect of the design pushed the boundaries of what submarine technology could achieve, creating vessels that were as much underwater cruisers as submarines in the traditional sense. The engineering challenges were immense. A submarine's hull must be circular to resist the pressure of deep submersion, but an aircraft hangar must be large enough to accommodate folded aircraft with their wings and floats. The designers solved this by creating a hybrid hull form with a figure-8 cross-section that maintained the circular pressure hull for the main crew spaces while adding a cylindrical hangar above. The hangar was nearly 35 meters long and 4 meters in diameter, large enough to store 3 aircraft with their wings folded and their components carefully arranged. A hydraulic catapult on the forward deck would launch the aircraft. Recovery would be accomplished by crane after the planes landed on the water alongside the surfaced submarine. The Aichi M6A Seiran was designed specifically for the I-400 mission. It was a sleek, low-wing monoplane capable of carrying an 800-kilogram bomb or a torpedo, with a range of over 1,000 kilometers and a speed exceeding 500 kilometers per hour. Unlike the fragile float planes previously used on submarines, the Seiran was a genuine attack aircraft, capable of penetrating defended airspace and delivering its ordnance with accuracy. Its floats could be jettisoned for missions where the aircraft would not return to the submarine, converting it into a disposable weapon whose pilot would make a one-way flight. The kamikaze mentality that pervaded Japanese military thinking in the war's final years was built into the aircraft's design. Construction of the I-400 class began in 1943 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan's most advanced shipbuilding facility. The program was given high priority, but it competed for resources with dozens of other desperate projects as Japan's industrial base began to crumble under American bombing. Steel, copper, and specialized equipment were all in short supply. Skilled workers were being drafted into the military or killed in air raids. The American submarine campaign was strangling the flow of raw materials from Southeast Asia. Every I-400 that entered service represented a massive investment of resources that Japan could barely afford. The first boat, I-400, was launched in January 1944 and commissioned that December. Her sister, I-401, followed close behind, entering service in January 1945. A third boat, I-402, was completed but converted to a tanker role to address Japan's desperate fuel shortage, eliminating her aircraft capability. Additional units were planned but never completed, their construction abandoned as American air raids destroyed the facilities and materials needed to finish them. The 3 operational boats represented the program's final output, a fraction of the fleet Yamamoto had envisioned. Training the crews to operate these complex vessels and the aircraft they carried consumed months of precious time. The submarine crews had to master not only the standard skills of submarine warfare, but also the unique challenges of aircraft handling, catapult operations, and coordination with aviation personnel. The Seiran pilots had to learn to fly an aircraft that existed in small numbers, to launch from a catapult that subjected them to forces their previous training had not prepared them for, and to navigate across vast stretches of ocean to targets they would identify by map reading alone. Everything was new, everything was improvised, everything was rushed because time was running out. The original mission plan called for the I-400s to attack the Panama Canal, the narrow waterway that allowed American warships to move between the Atlantic and Pacific without the long voyage around South America. Destroying the canal locks would trap ships on the wrong side of the Americas, delaying reinforcements and complicating American logistics for months or years. The plan was audacious, requiring the submarines to sail across the entire Pacific through waters patrolled by American aircraft and warships to launch an attack against one of the most strategically important and heavily defended installations in the Western Hemisphere. The attack concept evolved through several iterations. Early plans called for the Seiran aircraft to make conventional bombing runs against the canal locks, dropping their ordnance and returning to the submarines for recovery. Later versions contemplated one-way kamikaze attacks, with pilots deliberately crashing into the lock gates to ensure destruction. The submarines would carry biological weapons in some proposals, infecting the canal zone with diseases that would incapacitate workers and defenders. Each revision reflected Japan's growing desperation and its willingness to consider any tactic, however extreme, that might reverse the war's trajectory. By mid-1945, the Panama Canal mission had been overtaken by events. American forces were closing in on the home islands from multiple directions. Okinawa fell in June, giving the Americans an air base within easy striking distance of Japan itself. The kamikaze campaigns, which had initially shown promise against the invasion fleets, were consuming pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The strategic situation had deteriorated beyond the point where a single spectacular attack could make a difference. The canal might be destroyed, but Japan would still be losing the war. The I-400s were reassigned to a new mission, Operation Arashi, an attack on the American carrier fleet anchored at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Ulithi was the forward base for American carrier operations against Japan, a vast anchorage where dozens of warships refueled, rearmed, and rested between combat sorties. A successful attack against the concentrated fleet could destroy multiple carriers, delaying American operations for months and perhaps buying time for Japan to prepare its defenses against the inevitable invasion. The Seiran aircraft would approach at dawn, their pilots expecting to die in kamikaze attacks against the anchored ships. The I-400 and I-401 departed for Ulithi in August 1945, sailing separately to reduce the chance of both being lost to a single attack. They carried their Seiran aircraft in the waterproof hangars, their pilots prepared for missions from which they would not return. The submarines navigated across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, submerging by day to avoid American patrol aircraft, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and refresh their air. The crews lived in conditions of extreme tension, knowing that detection meant death, knowing that their mission was the last hope of a nation on the brink of extinction. They never reached their target. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, bringing the war to an end before Operation Arashi could be executed. The I-400s received the news by radio, along with orders to surface, display black flags, and proceed to the nearest Allied port. For the crews who had prepared to die, the surrender was a strange mixture of relief and confusion. The mission they had trained for, the death they had expected, had been rendered meaningless by events beyond their control. They were alive when they had expected to be dead, and the Japan they served had ceased to exist as they had known it. The surrender orders included specific instructions to destroy anything that might be of value to the enemy. Aircraft were to be pushed overboard, documents burned, weapons disabled. The commanders of the I-400s complied, launching their Seiran aircraft with empty tanks and no pilots, letting them crash into the sea rather than fall into American hands. The submarines themselves, however, were too valuable to destroy without explicit authorization. They proceeded to designated surrender points, where American naval teams would board them and take possession of technology that the United States had never imagined existed. The American reaction to the I-400s combined astonishment with intense technical interest. Naval intelligence officers who boarded the submarines found themselves aboard vessels that exceeded anything in the American inventory in size, range, and capability. The underwater aircraft carrier concept, which American designers had dismissed as impractical, had been realized by Japanese engineers in ways that demanded careful study. The captured submarines were sailed to Pearl Harbor and later to the continental United States, where teams of experts examined every system, photographed every component, and interviewed every crew member willing to talk. The Soviet Union, now a potential adversary rather than an ally, demanded access to the captured submarines under the terms of the surrender agreement that called for sharing of Japanese military technology. The United States, unwilling to let the Soviets study vessels that represented a potential leap in submarine capability, made a fateful decision. In late 1946, the I-400, I-401, and other captured Japanese submarines were taken to sea off Hawaii and scuttled in deep water. The technology they represented was sent to the bottom rather than shared with a nation that was rapidly becoming an enemy. The scuttling was effective, but not permanent. In 2005, researchers from the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory discovered the wreck of the I-401 lying on the seafloor off Oahu, her hull intact, her conning tower rising from the sediment like a memorial to the ambitions that had created her. The I-400 was found in 2013, resting upright on the bottom at a depth of nearly 700 meters. The submarines that Japan had built to win the war had become archaeological artifacts, their secrets long since superseded by technological developments they had helped to inspire. The legacy of the I-400 class extended far beyond the vessels themselves. The concept of the submarine aircraft carrier, dismissed as impractical before the Japanese demonstrated its feasibility, influenced post-war naval thinking in ways that are still visible today. American designers studied the captured boats and incorporated lessons learned into subsequent submarine development. The emphasis on range, payload capacity, and the ability to project power from beneath the sea that characterized Cold War submarine programs owed something to the Japanese boats that had pioneered these capabilities. The I-400s were failures in their immediate mission, but they were successes as proofs of concept that shaped future development. The cruise missile submarines of the Cold War era were direct descendants of the I-400 concept, substituting missiles for aircraft but retaining the fundamental idea of a submarine as a platform for striking land targets from concealed positions at sea. The Regulus missile submarines of the 1950s and the later ballistic missile submarines that became the ultimate deterrent weapons of the nuclear age followed a logical path from the hangars of the I-400 to the launch tubes of modern boats. The Japanese had envisioned submarines as strategic strike platforms rather than purely naval weapons, and this vision proved prophetic. The men who served aboard the I-400s faced complex fates after the war. Some returned to civilian life, their wartime service a closed chapter that they rarely discussed. Others were detained by American occupation authorities for interrogation about their knowledge of Japanese submarine technology. A few faced prosecution for war crimes unrelated to the I-400 program, their fates determined by actions taken before they joined the submarine service. The pilots who had prepared to die in kamikaze attacks lived instead, their expected sacrifices transformed into decades of post-war existence that some found difficult to reconcile with the death they had embraced. The Aichi M6A Seiran aircraft that the I-400s were designed to carry became some of the rarest survivors of the Pacific War. Only one complete example exists today, painstakingly restored and displayed at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. The aircraft's unique design and specialized mission meant that few were built, and most were destroyed either in combat, in training accidents, or in the deliberate destruction that preceded surrender. The surviving Seiran stands as a testament to Japanese aeronautical engineering and to the ambition that produced an aircraft designed for missions that were never flown. The strategic concept behind the I-400 program, the idea of striking directly at American homeland targets to change the course of the war, reflected both Japan's desperate situation and its profound misunderstanding of American psychology. Japanese planners assumed that attacks on American soil would demoralize the public and force the government to seek a negotiated peace. This assumption ignored everything that the American response to Pearl Harbor had demonstrated about national resolve under attack. An attack on the Panama Canal or American cities would have hardened American determination, not weakened it. The I-400s were designed to accomplish a goal that could not be accomplished, even if their missions had succeeded. Yet the program also reflected a technological vision that transcended its immediate military context. The Japanese engineers who designed the I-400s were pushing boundaries that their counterparts in other navies had not attempted. They created the largest submarines of their era, the first true underwater aircraft carriers, vessels capable of projecting power across oceanic distances in ways that anticipated developments decades in the future. Their achievement was compromised by the circumstances that produced it, the desperation, the resource constraints, the shortage of time. But it was an achievement nonetheless. The I-400 class represented the culmination of Japan's submarine ambitions and the final expression of a naval strategy that had failed. Japan had entered the war believing that bold strokes and warrior spirit could overcome industrial inferiority. The I-400s were the ultimate bold stroke, weapons designed to bypass American strength and strike at American vulnerability. But by the time they were ready, there were no vulnerabilities left to exploit, no bold strokes that could undo the years of attrition, no warrior spirit that could overcome the mathematical reality of defeat. The submarines that were supposed to change the war arrived too late to change anything. The ocean that surrounds Hawaii now holds the remains of these remarkable vessels, their ambitions as corroded as their hulls, their missions as forgotten as the empire that conceived them. Divers who reach the I-401's resting place find a ghost ship, her hangar doors closed, her catapult still mounted on the foredeck, her conning tower standing sentinel over secrets that no longer matter. The I-400 lies nearby in the darkness, another monument to a war that ended before her purpose could be fulfilled. They are memorials to ingenuity and futility, to the human capacity for creating remarkable things in pursuit of terrible goals. 3 submarines, each larger than anything its enemies possessed. 6 aircraft designed for missions that would have killed their pilots. Crews who trained for months to execute attacks that were cancelled days before they could be launched. The I-400 program was a tragedy of timing, a masterpiece of engineering that arrived at the moment when engineering could no longer save the nation that had produced it. The underwater aircraft carriers that Japan built to win the war became instead symbols of why Japan lost. Too little, too late, too far removed from the industrial and strategic realities that determined the conflict's outcome. The war ended, the submarines sank, the empire dissolved. What remains is the memory of an achievement that was real even if its purpose was frustrated, of vessels that existed at the boundary of what technology could accomplish, of men who prepared to die for missions that history denied them. The I-400 class was Japan's secret weapon, hidden until surrender revealed it, studied until scuttling concealed it, discovered again when technology allowed exploration of depths that had seemed unreachable. They were aircraft carriers that never launched aircraft in anger, submarines that never reached their targets, weapons that never fired. They were magnificent failures, and they deserved to be remembered as such. The future that the I-400s represented, submarines as platforms for power projection, as strategic weapons rather than merely naval ones, would be realized by other nations, in other forms. The missile submarines of the Cold War, carrying nuclear warheads that could destroy cities, were the spiritual successors of the underwater aircraft carriers that Japan had pioneered. The strategic logic was the same: use the ocean's concealment to position devastating weapons within striking distance of enemy homelands, creating threats that conventional defenses could not counter. The Japanese had seen this future first, even if they could not reach it. History records the I-400 class as a footnote, a curiosity, a what-if that never became what was. But footnotes can be revealing, and curiosities can illuminate the larger stories that contain them. The I-400s illuminate Japan's final year of war, the desperation that drove technological innovation to its limits, the human cost of ambitions that exceeded the resources available to realize them. They illuminate the nature of submarine warfare, the possibilities that the technology contained, the futures that engineers could envision, even when strategists could not achieve. They illuminate the war itself, the terrible logic that drove both sides to extremes that peacetime minds could not have imagined. 3 submarines, 3 aircraft each, one mission that was never executed, and a legacy that outlasted the nation that created them, the war that defined them, and the men who served aboard them. The I-400 class was Japan's greatest submarine achievement and its greatest submarine failure, a triumph of engineering that could not overcome the failures of strategy and resources that doomed its purpose. They were the secret aircraft carriers that came too late, and their story deserves to be told precisely because they never had the chance to write their own